It's now my great pleasure to welcome the second of our speakers, who's going to give a talk more focused on our national interests, and that's Stuart Martin, who is king of the Space Applications Catapult at Harwell, and whose objective... King, yes indeed. Well, he's certainly CEO, I'm sure that's the same thing. And whose the objective of the catapult is very much to connect, as Stuart no doubt will explain in detail, connect the space capabilities to those that wish to exploit them, and particularly in some of the smaller and medium enterprises. Stuart.
Well, thank you very much, Sir Martin, for that yes, very interesting introduction. And thank you to Sir Martin and the Royal Society for the opportunity to help organise this event and to speak at it, because I think it is actually an event whose time has very much come. So I'm going to be talking about, as Martin said, a bit of a scene setting for what we're talking about today, looking at the challenges we have in the UK, but I'm also encouraging us very much to look at those challenges within that global context, some of which we've just heard about, and see that context as a real opportunity for growth within the UK and around the world. So I'm going to start by just a brief introduction about catapults. Can I just ask, who has heard of catapults? That's fantastic. I think it's getting better every time. I think that's the best response I've ever seen. The word is getting out there. Catapults exist, and catapults are making a difference. So that's really good news. So I won't go too much into this. But what I will say is that an important thing to realise about catapults is that they are here for the private sector predominantly. Yet we've been established by government, but we are private sector led, and I think that gives us something different in the perspective, in the way that we look at the market and the way that we try and interact with it, which I think is what's making our contribution quite so unique. But other than that, I won't say any more. When we're talking about transformation, or when we're talking about setting up a transformation, I find it very useful to be thinking about the endpoint, the world that we're moving towards, rather than the place that we're starting from. So these bubbles came from a paper I wrote for the Space Leadership Council a year or so ago, just trying to set out what the world of 2030 is going to look like. And talking about an autonomous planet, the move towards autonomous cars, ships, planes, a connected planet where we have truly ubiquitous communications, and we don't worry about Wi-Fi codes, we don't worry about internet protocols. We just know that wherever we are, our devices are going to be connected and we can rely on them communicating. Talking about a sustainable planet, some of what we've just been hearing about, a world where everything we do, we are much more confident that the resources that we're using are being managed in a sustainable way. And we're talking about a self-aware planet, a planet where observability, knowledge of what's going on in the planet is far higher. Where we have satellites that are going to be observing places on the Earth, not maybe once every few days, but every few minutes. Potentially, there are companies around who are planning to put systems in place that will observe every piece of land on the Earth every 15 minutes. And so that's going to give us completely new sense of awareness. And so that's the context that we're moving towards. And as I was putting together the presentation today, it became very clear that all of these elements are very relevant to the discussions that we're having about the future of agriculture and the role of technology in delivering our food supply of the future. And again, a word that came through in that last slide was planet. It's all about the planet. It's about the global impact and the opportunity to use satellites to deliver solutions at scale. So this is a slide you'll have recognised. Barbara was presented a very similar slide just a moment ago. But what I want us all to be thinking about is when we're building the solutions that we need in the UK, if we're going to get the maximum economic benefit out of that and the maximum impact from that, we should be thinking about how we're building solutions that we can scale quickly and we can actually deliver on a global scale. And satellite technologies really help you do that because of the fact that the infrastructure is available and deliverable globally right from the start. And you don't need to go too far into all of the areas there to realise the role of agriculture in delivering the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but in particular the areas of hunger and life on land are two particular areas that if you were to drill down, you'd find them very quickly coming to the topics that we're talking about. So I want to just now look at the problem in hand and try and characterise what are the challenges of agriculture that we can start to try and address. And I think the way that really helped me understand what the nature of the challenge was looking at the scales of variability. You have long-term fundamental properties in the landscape, so that's the properties of your land, your exposure, your geographic location. It's what the French would call terroir, and so these are the fundamental properties that impact the way that you farm. These aren't things that you can control necessarily, but things you need to understand and utilise to your advantage as best you possibly can. Then you have these mid-term properties, so if the long-term properties are at the decadal, 100-year time scale, then the mid-term properties are at the multi-year time scale. And these are the things that affect your soil quality, your nutrients levels, which will be impacting your cropping cycle and your management processes. And then you have the sort of the in-season uncontrollable factors. So these are the local weather conditions, the one-off events, which again, if you can manage the mid-term properties, you have to sort of try and mitigate and respond quickly to the in-season uncontrollable factors so that you can minimise their impact. So I think the interesting thing around agriculture is the interplay between these three different scales of variability, and the challenge that we face now, coming from two different levels really. One is the need to be able to be more productive and to be more efficient and do better about the way that we produce food with a growing population and the increasing demands on the way that we use our land from a societal or an ecological point of view, at the same time as increasing the production, and also the new threats or the new impacts coming from climate change, which impact both the short-term uncontrollable factors and the fact that we have these much higher frequency, perhaps more severe events that we're used to, and also now starting to impact the long-term fundamental properties. We can't rely on the fact that we can always grow a certain crop in a certain location forever into the future. That's a question now that we have to start asking when we're making our long-term strategic decisions about where we're going to source our food from. Increasingly important for the supermarkets and the food supply chain. If we're placing a 10-year contract to buy coffee from a particular location, what confidence do we have that in 10 years' time coffee is going to be a viable product in that location? So that sort of decision making is coming into place too. The good news is that we're good at this stuff. This is something that we do very well in the UK, provide the information that we're going to need in those areas. So if I read from left to right on here. So we have the sensors, the satellites, the airborne sensors, UAVs is a very rapidly growing sector, and of course the in situ sensors or the instrumented machinery that we now have on our farms. The UK is in all of those sectors at a world-leading level. We're also on the data side. I'm not going to sort of quote any numbers about the volumes of data that are now being produced. I think you all know that the amount of data that's coming down now is growing graphically, is growing tremendously. But my CTO, the term he uses is that data is the new mud. So there is so much data around, it has almost zero intrinsic value, but there is elements within that data, if you have the ways of extracting it, that can be extremely valuable. And so what's important then is the analytical process, is the way you view that data, the way you combine it with other information to extract from it actionable information that you can actually use to improve the way that you operate. And the other part of that is the satellite technology revolution. So, I mean, we started to talk about that a little bit already. You see the diagram on the left there, you'll see that a small number of these are the high resolution satellites that are flying today. Unfortunately, I haven't managed to update that for your most recent satellites, Martin, but there's about 15 or 20 high-resolution satellites, which means that you have opportunities to get a high-resolution image of most places on Earth, pretty much every day. You can't always get it every day because there are cloud cover and those sorts of things, but there is that opportunity for you, and on the right-hand side there, you actually see the transformation that's coming in now from the Sentinel program, the Sentinel-2 program, Sentinel-1 and Sentinel-2, which is a huge amount of open data coming from the European Space Agency. In the case of the Sentinel-1, it's radar data, so it sees through the clouds. It's not impacted by the sort of same visibility constraints that we have from optical imagery, and we have the Sentinel-2 network, which has just started being constructed last year. So Sentinel-1, we now have 2 satellites up and running. So the first one was launched 2 years ago, the second one was launched 2 months ago, and that means that for everywhere on Earth now, we are getting an image from that network every 5 days. And so that's free, it's becoming available very quickly, and so there are a number of businesses now that are starting to look at that and how they can take advantage of that. But you still have a growing number of companies now who are building more and more networks of satellites, which are adding to that mix of data available, both from the public sector and for the private sector. And there's no doubt that when you are able to, instead of where we are now, being able to get an image, maybe every day, but probably realistically once a week, if that moves into a land where you have the potential to get several images per day all over the world, then that really is opening up some dramatic new possibilities. So I'm going to give an example of a project that we're working on with AgSpace, and I know you're going to be hearing from Vince Gillingham later on today. So this is actually an optical map, so you can see the sort of the typical variation in fields that you have there. What we're doing is we're looking at the crop stage growth of oilseed rape. So we're looking, I'm going to get this number wrong, I think there's about 14 different crop stages in oilseed rape. So it's the early leaf development, the early flowering, the mid-flowering, the late flowering, the seed setting, and when the seed's ripening. And so it's that whole sequence of events, which is fundamental to the way that you treat this crop, is understanding when those events are happening and what different processes you need to apply to your crop at different stages. And what you can see here is that we're using looking at some Canadian data that has been collected over the last couple of years to try and understand the way that radar data can be used to detect those different stages. And so you can see for those different fields, you're looking at sort of different reflection response from the radar data in those different fields. And as we go through a few different sequences there, you can see the different colors changing, and you're seeing different crops behaving in a different way in response to the radar. And as you go through there, what you see then is that at those different growth stages, you're getting different reflectance qualities from the radar, and those different lines correspond to different fields within a different farm. So you can see that you're able to derive the fact that the crops are evolving at different rates. You can start to impact your treatment plans around the seasonal variability, the variance that we've talked, the short-term variability that we're talking about, which is responding to weather events and the like. And also you can prioritize certain fields over other fields because their crops are developing faster, and that will enable you to get maybe that few extra percentage points of yield at the end just by ordering the way that you apply your treatment to the different fields. And I think what's really exciting about this is when we're talking about how we make this globally impactful, is that when we started to solve this for a few cases, and I think we're working on about 30 farms at the moment, is that right, Vince? And in a demonstration project that we're doing together with the European Space Agency. And when we've got that information for a few farms, it's very easy and very straightforward to scale up locally, regionally, nationally, and then globally using that technology. And once you have that knowledge of information across a large scale, you can start doing all sorts of other things with that data. So you will know the health of the oilseed rape crop across the whole of the UK, across the whole of Europe, across the whole of whatever region you want to be talking about, in a much deeper knowledge than anybody else. I mean, clearly everybody knows the state of their own local field in response to weather events. They will know whether they will get a higher yield or lower yield than normal, but nobody knows that information on a truly national or regional or global basis. And it's having that extra knowledge that I think is going to really be impactful in terms of how we try and smooth out some of that variability in the food prices and add that extra security to the food supply that we're all trying to achieve. So I think that's a fantastic opportunity, not only to provide service into the agricultural community, but once we've got that there, the broader potential for impact there is enormous. So it's not just Earth observation we're talking about, though. I think it's important that we realise that, and many of the conversations that I have with farmers are actually very simple about connectivity, and much of what they would like to do are being impacted by poor connectivity in rural locations, not only in the UK but everywhere around the world has this as a fundamental challenge, and I think there are opportunities for all of us there. And again, if we solve those sort of problems using satellites, then those sort of solutions are immediately translatable more regionally or more internationally. So looking at our agriculture sector very briefly, this is certainly not my area of specialism, but there is a fantastic agri-tech strategy document which I've spent a little bit of time studying, which talks about the £96 billion food industry or agriculture industry that we have in the UK. It talks about the food exports that we create in the UK, about £18 billion a year, which for us in the very modest space sector we look at with some envy, but perhaps it's not surprising. 3.8 million people work in the food sector, so getting on for 10% of our adult workforce. But the one thing there that I don't think we actually really calculate yet, but I think where there's a huge opportunity is in the export of agricultural food and services. And I think that's the opportunity which I want us to have on our horizon as we go through the discussion today. And as well as solving the challenges that we have in the UK, let's see what we can do to unlock some of those opportunities that take us much more broadly and really add to the productivity and the global resilience. So, I mean, that's all I wanted to say. I think there's a huge opportunity here for the way that we manage our information and the way that we manage the data that's applicable to the agriculture sector. And I think there's a huge opportunity to think about it in ways that are not only going to solve the challenges that we have here in the UK, but are going to be truly impactful on a global scale at the same time as delivering economic benefits. So I'll stop there. I'll leave you to just watch that little tractor going around and applying its spray very selectively around the field. And I hope that's been of interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And assuming you're not totally mesmerised by the graphics, can we take any questions? Let's start right at the back, and then we'll come to the front in a moment. And if I can just, whilst the microphone is making its way, if I can remind you just to state your affiliation and try to be concise.
Hi, thanks. My name's Mira. I'm with Initiatives for Land, Lives and Peace. It seems to me that the satellite imagery works well in large monocropping areas. So I'm wondering if there is any applications for multi-crop or smallholder farming areas?
Well, I think most satellites are able to operate at the 5 to 20 meter scale, and you have a few that are very high resolution. But there are a lot of satellites that quite comfortably operate at that sort of scale, which even for multi-cropping is completely applicable. I think that there's a tendency to think sometimes that you need information at the meter level, whereas actually if you really don't, and you can get a lot of information at the 5 to 20 meter level. So I think a lot of what we do is on multi-crop farms. It's not all just about the monocropping programs.
Thank you. And gentleman there, and then gentleman here.
Toby Bruce, Rothamsted Research. Thank you for your fantastic talk. Very interesting that you have oilseed rape in the UK as your case study. There's been some pretty serious challenges with this cabbage stem flea beetle affecting the crop establishment. I believe that about 5% of the UK crop area has failed to establish due to this insect pest. Have you been able to detect any of that with your satellite observations?
Yeah, well, the data that I was showing today was actually looking at some historical data. I know that there's work tracking this year's growth going on at the moment using Sentinel-1, so I'm gonna pass that to Vince. I don't know if you're able to comment more on that.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, Vince from AgSpace, Vince Gillingham. So the 2014 data you've seen was looking at actually oilseed rape and wheat, and this year we've been concentrating on oilseed rape, barley and wheat. We are picking up the differences this year in the failed wheat crop, not just in the SAR data but also in the optical data. I'll come on later on with my talk to sort of discuss the need for both. We've just looked at SAR there, but there's a real case where both technologies need to be integrated and fused to get the best from it.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. Gentleman had his hand up earlier.
Hello, Alan Bullion from Informa. My question was, what's the cost of all of this? You spoke about exporting to other countries, presumably developing world farmers. So what are the costs involved both to domestic and global farmers? And how are you going to make it scale up in an affordable and accessible way?
Well, the great thing about the Sentinel program in particular is that the costs are already sunk. So the satellites are already built, they're already there, the data is free, and you can get it now, today. So what's happening is that there's an industry growing up with Vince and AgSpace and others who are using this data to try and present information to farmers which is meaningful and has a demonstrable economic return. If you know, the example we were talking about oilseed rape, that only works if there is value to the farmers in having that information throughout the growing season, so that they can use it to improve yields or to mitigate some of the short-term issues. So yeah, I think the historical barrier, which has been about the cost of imagery and then the cost of interpreting it and managing it yourself, I think is, you know, that is a historical legacy. I think we're now moving into a completely new era where we have a service culture that's around managing this data and providing information at, you know, economic cost points, economic price points to the farming community. And I think you're just going to see more of that sort of thing over the next 3 or 4 years.
A question right at the far back. Sorry, Philippa, you're going to have to.
Thank you so much. This is amazing that you're going to provide this to the actual people in the developing countries. My name is Bramley Lingdo. I'm from Worldview Impact, and we are actually restoring about 80,000 hectares of mangroves in the Arawaddy Delta in Myanmar, and it's a country that's just come out, you know, from a military regime, and now we have a democratic government in state. But, you know, NASA satellites predict that 15% of the mangroves cover remain, but the rest has been wiped out, and mangrove ecosystems around the world, only 50% remain. But these ecosystems are really valuable for flood control, for preventing storms, hurricanes. You know, they provide fish and livestock, and they store 5 times more carbon than terrestrial trees. Is there any way through your satellite we can actually measure how much of these ecosystems the forest by the tide actually lost, and how much storage of carbon sink is actually there, and if soils are being restored by the coast over time? As you say, satellites will be taking pictures of it, so we can actually calculate the the amount of carbon that is stored in these ecosystems as they're being restored and regenerated. Same thing with terrestrial soils, because soil on planet Earth store a lot of carbon, trillions of tons. So if we are to regenerate our soils in an organic way, not using too much chemicals, we can suck the carbon back from the atmosphere at a planetary scale. But that technology is not there yet to actually measure that impact. I was wondering if this technology will do that in the future, because I know there are different satellites that measure forests, carbon stock in forests, but not soil yet. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of questions in there and lots of points in there, but I'll answer quickly by saying yes, you can do this. And there are companies now who are using satellites to measure, as you say, carbon stockage in forests. I think there is a new satellite coming along called Biomass, which is another European Space Agency satellite, which is going to be focused very much on that challenge and understanding, where all the biomass is. I think they're understanding the storage of carbon in the soil, which was the point that you were making, in order to understand nutrient levels and the impact of new policies about low tillage policies and those sorts of things. I think that's people are starting to look at that as well. So I think that's all happening. And I think the important point you made around the loss of mangroves and the environmental impact that's happening, I think that plays extremely well to what Barbara was just talking about, and the importance of having this long-term archive of data so that you can spot what are the impacts, and then you can look back to see what some of the reasons for those impacts might be, which will then help you make the case and make help people understand the importance of some of these ecological preventatives in solving some of the challenges that we're actually trying to deal with as we go into the future. So I think that's a really important piece of work and really important resource that we have, that historical data, using tools like the data cube to try and help us analyse it and bring out that understanding.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Ashlyn. I'm a student at Rothamsted Research. I think this is all really interesting. I just wanted to ask a question. So everything you're looking at is fairly static. What about the stuff that moves, the biomass that moves? What's the potential for satellite-based imagery to track moving things?
Are you talking about livestock?
I'm talking about insects particularly. That's what I work on. But it doesn't have to be insects. It could be birds, it could be bats. It could be all the other organisms that relate to the ecosystem services that sometimes underpin farming.
Yeah, I mean, you can't see insects from space. I'm sure that's not a surprise. But you can see the impact of insects. So another project that we've been working on is helping coffee growers in Africa, and there's all sorts of things that they need help with. One of which is just basic weather forecasting, because that's the importance of the 3-day weather forecast to the coffee crop is vital, because they need to harvest at a time when they know they're going to have a period of time when they can leave the beans out to dry, and so often they lose the harvest just because they've picked it at the wrong time and didn't have an accurate weather forecast. So that's one thing we do. But another thing that we do is we're helping them understand the movement of pests in the area, so that when we can see that there's something happening nearby, we can inform farmers. They can make sure that they get the pesticides in place at the right time and not spray unnecessarily at the wrong time, so that they're ready for that migration as it starts to happen. So it's those sorts of things we can start to do.
So, and can I ask how? How do you see where they are? I mean,
because you can see the impact that they're having. You can see when they're arriving at a neighbouring field. You can see the degradation to leaf quality and all those sorts of things.
I think if I could add to that as well, there's been some projects in sub-Saharan Africa looking at the locust migration, and if you understand the life cycle of the locust, then you can look at the climatic conditions in the certain areas where they're going to breed, and then you know that over a period of time they're going to migrate, and that gives you a heads up on where to go spray your insecticides at the right time. Sorry, there's some other questions. In the front, then I've got someone at the back afterwards.
Good morning. My name is Rupert Dent, and I'm with a company called AMUAS. We're one of the early commercial UAV operators in the UK. Can I ask a question about consistency of policy? Free data coming from the satellites is a tremendous idea, and I can see that it stimulates a tremendous amount of commercial possibilities. How likely, in your view, is that policy to remain consistent across the whole of Europe and perhaps the US, or will that continue, or will pricing, inevitably governments find themselves in a position where they need to get money from somewhere, sooner or later they turn to things that were sort of free at point of sale, change policy and so on. What's your view about the consistency?
I mean, a lot of work has gone into the data policy around Sentinel, a lot of consultation, and I can't see that changing anytime soon. It's so fundamental to the program now, and I think when you start, the evidence starts to be calculated or collected, like we have now for Landsat. I mean, it would be a very strange policy shift to move back to the environment beforehand. I don't know, Stephen, do you want to say anything about that?
Thanks very much. Stephen Briggs from the European Space Agency. Yeah, I think there's a preliminary question before that, which is, will the data technically be available? And that's perhaps a more fundamental question. And that's been the most significant change in the development of the Copernicus program in Europe. Because now in the past you've heard about, even Landsat was always funded one satellite at a time. And there was always a long debate, whilst one was flying, should we have another? And each time the answer was yes, but it was only after a very long battle. The whole premise of the Copernicus program is that there are now 6 series of different types of satellite, each which have multiple components. So you've heard Sentinel 1 and 2 today. The Sentinel 1 system is two contemporaneous flying radar systems. They have a lifetime of 7 years, so Sentinels 1A and 1B are currently flying. 1C and 1D are already paid for, being built, and will be launched in 2022 and 2023. And so we already have a guarantee of continuity of Sentinel-1 data and Sentinel-2 and so on from now until the 2030s. And there are already plans in place now to look at what will happen beyond 2030 for the next generation. It's very like meteorological data which have been available since 1978 with the Meteosat program. We're now on Meteosat 3rd generation, which will take us up to 2040. And the polar orbiting METOP satellites, which will take us into the 2030s as well. So the first thing is you can now guarantee that if you change your business practices to start basing them on the use of satellite data, you can guarantee that you have at least another 30 years worth of those data to be available. So physically they will be available. Now the second question is, will they be available freely? That's always a question. There was a long debate about this, and the examples which Barbara quoted about Landsat were very instrumental in developing the policy. There's no question that the only question about the availability of data is whether it becomes incompetitive with commercial suppliers. And that was the big debate that was held in Europe up until about 2 years ago. And the convention which resolved was that data from 5-meter resolution and above will be provided by governments free of charge. Data at lower resolution than that are currently deemed to be in the private sector. That number may change. And there's no current government intention to supply free data at a resolution below 5-meter resolution. So there's a sort of, maybe it's a gentleman's agreement that free data will be available continuously beyond with a resolution of 5 meters and above, and the government won't interfere with the commercial markets for higher resolution data below that. That's the current situation. If it were to change, I think it's much more likely that more free data will be available than less. So there may well be that governments might move down with that 5-meter resolution to a lower resolution. I think it's very unlikely that the data from 5 meters upwards will ever become charged for by governments in future, because of the arguments which demonstrate that the government return, the same thing has happened in the US with the weather data. NOAA used to charge for its weather data, and it stopped doing so when it discovered that the return to government from the revenue generated from the taxes from the companies which were taking the free data and generating business, the taxable revenue which came from those was 3 orders of magnitude greater than the data costs, the sales of data which they achieved. So actually it's much better business for government to give the data away and capitalize on the taxable revenue which comes back afterwards.
Thank you very much. Question right at the back.
My name's Mickey Allen. I'm an exploration geologist. I've been using Landsat for many years. I just wondered what the tie-in is between the macro and the micro in terms of the Internet of Things and sensors in the field with drones. How would that tie in with the satellites?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And all these sensors are completely complementary. So I've already been having a conversation with someone this morning who's using sensors in the field, and we were talking about how you might have 2 sensors that will cover you 30 acres or even more, and actually having some way to use satellite information to get an occasional snapshot that will allow you to interpolate and understand what the landscape is like around those 2 sensors is extremely valuable. And I think UAVs have the same interplay. I think the levels between the ground sensors, the UAVs, and the satellites, there are many ways for those technologies to work together because they're so complementary. I mean, you can fly a UAV whenever you want. A satellite you will get whenever it comes over if it's not cloudy or if you've got radar. So there are unique things you can do with UAVs you can't do with satellites, and vice versa. And by combining those things, you get the best of both worlds.
Thank you very much. Well, I think I'd like to thank you very much, Stuart, for your contribution, and also Barbara, because I think this is certainly the scene-setting first session. And we're going to take a break for coffee. I do think, however, we are really on the cusp of the exploitation of Earth observation data, because we see changes both in the ability to have more frequent imaging from space with developments, particularly in small satellites, allowing affordable constellations which will give us very rapid repeats, and that is very complementary to the advances we see on terrestrial computing and the communications infrastructure, which allows that data to be interpreted and distributed very efficiently. So I think that we are really right on the edge of a major shift in Earth observation and its applications. So I'd like to both say thank Stuart and Barbara once again. We're going to have a coffee. This is, please get back by 11:15, so have half an hour to network. And this is a really important part of the conference today, which is to get the discussions going between the groups that are here. Thank you very much.